dyslexic kids need to know that they're dyslexic. And they need to know that things will be hard, but they need to know that they are not limited in what they can achieve, really.
We're Nick and Sonia, and this is Dyslexia Journey. And today we are so happy to welcome Abby. Abby is going to be part of our Dyslexic Voices series. Also, she does have a YouTube channel of her own called Political Psych with Abby. Welcome, Abby.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just start at the beginning. Tell us about like your earlier years, possibly before you were identified as dyslexic, whatever you want to say sort of to start out how this journey has been for you.
Yeah, so I was diagnosed super young, so I don't have a lot of memories from before I was diagnosed because I was diagnosed at like 6. Um and um actually apparently my teachers started thinking I had dyslexia even earlier than that, like when I was about 5 or so. Um because I really loved being read to and I clearly really wanted to read. And I was very, very well spoken as a small child. So they thought, okay, well, something's going on because like she can just not read at all. And there's no association between letters and sounds. Like it's just not happening with reading, right? Um, so yeah, my parents had me diagnosed at the recommendation of my teachers when I was in kindergarten, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. I was, I mean, like as a really little kid, I was an odd kid. I tended to get on better with grown-ups than I did with other children. I don't think that's a dyslexia thing. I was just a strange child. And I was really into like mythology and history and stuff. I also liked fairies, little kid stuff, right? Because I was like 6 when I was diagnosed, so there's not really that much to say. Um, I had the typical, good parents. They read to me all the time, all that kind of thing. Um, yeah. But yeah, so I was diagnosed when I was 6, so there's not a lot to tell from before then.
Do you have a memory of the actual, I don't know what test they actually did, but do you have a memory of that?
Yeah, I mean, kind of. It's a little vague because of how young I was, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, um, it's also a little strange because like I had sensory issues as a kid, and I still do to some extent, but they're a lot better than they was when they were when I was like a little kid. Um, and I remember they like had me put on these big headphones and listen to a bunch of like sounds. And I guess they wanted me to identify them or something. I'm actually not quite sure like what part of the dyslexia assessment that is, but that was the bit that was like clearest to me, that it is clearest to me in my memory. And I remember really, really, really hating it. Um, I think it was both because I didn't like to fail at things as a child. I mean, I think a lot of kids are like that, but I think I was especially sensitive to failure. Um, and also because like it was these huge over-ear headphones, and my whole life I hated over-ear headphones. Probably not because of this. It's probably a sensory thing I had from before this, but I hated over-ear headphones, and it was, I was in an unfamiliar place and I was 6, so I remember being kind of freaked out by it. Um, Not really by the idea of being dyslexic or the idea of being diagnosed or anything. I just didn't like the testing environment, right? And then I also remember, I can't remember if this was during the initial evaluation or like, I think like 2 years later, my parents had me like go in for additional testing for something. I don't remember exactly what, but apparently the guy they had diagnosed me is some very noted expert. But he was also quite rude, or at least it seemed that way to a small child, because he was like on the phone while I was trying to do my test. Um, and I'm pretty sure that's not part of the test. Yeah. But those are really my clearest memories of that, right? Like it's funny what you remember when you're that young, right? Because I don't remember really anything where they were trying to get me to read or sound out letters or anything. I just remember the sounds and the guy being on the phone. And also like vaguely the configuration of the office, but not really the actual test. I think just because I was so young, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting what you mentioned about the sensory issues, because our daughter, who is dyslexic and she's a teenager now, and she had a lot of sensory issues as a young child as well. Like to the extent of where she would wear her clothes inside out so that the tags didn't rub on her and things like that.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't know if that, like you said, I don't know if that's correlated with dyslexia or not, but it's sort of
Yeah, I
interesting.
mean, I think it might be correlated, but I don't know. I don't know. I'm mostly thinking because so my mom isn't diagnosed dyslexic, but she's quite probably dyslexic. And she has different sensory issues than I do, but definitely is like very particular, very hypersensitive. Like she will straighten pictures in other people's houses. Um and like can perceive differences between colors that other people can't see and stuff.
Mhm.
And I definitely think like having a design sense is correlated with dyslexia. I mean, maybe I don't think I've necessarily seen like a formal study on that, but there's a lot of dyslexics with a really strong artistic and design sensibility. um
Yeah.
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 Um, I guess since you were diagnosed so young, it's kind of being dyslexic has kind of been a part of your identity for almost your whole life that you remember, right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. And my parents never hid it from me or anything, so like I
Mhm,
knew immediately.
mhm. So what was
Yeah.
that like then, in elementary school? Like, did you feel different from other kids
Yeah,
then, or
I mean, I guess a bit. I mean, like I said, I was kind of a weird kid other than the dyslexia. So, like, I feel like the reason I felt different wasn't like completely related to the dyslexia. But also, I think it was helped. Like, I was helped by the fact that for like preschool through third grade, I was in Montessori school.
Mhm,
And in a Montessori setting, every student gets a certain amount of like individualized attention. Every student is at different levels for different things and is treated differently. So, like, you don't have to feel that strange for being taken out of class for extra reading tutoring or whatever. And honestly, I think that that was a really good experience and was really helpful, especially with my dyslexia. I don't have kids, but I quite possibly want to have kids someday, and I've talked about it with my husband. I'm like, hey, I kind of want to have enough money to send them to Montessori school for the first little bit, especially because dyslexia is genetic, and there's a good chance that if I were to have kids they would be dyslexic as well. um I think I don't know if those odds go up because my husband is dyspraxic.
mm.
um but what was I gonna yeah, we're an incredibly clumsy household. There aren't a lot of sharp corners here. What was I gonna say?
Say about the Montessori schools, from what I remember about the Montessori methods, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a lot of use of manipulatives. So I'm wondering if that was useful in terms of more that almost tactile or spatial way of learning. Did that play in?
Oh, yeah, yeah, no, and I think that was super helpful for me, honestly, because, like, even now I read very well now, but one of the ways my dyslexia still affects me is I have a lot of difficulty remembering like long series of steps or really any sort of lengthy thing if there's not a narrative or like some reason it makes sense. Um, and so the Montessori method was very helpful because, you're not learning math in this like super abstract way. You're like actually manipulating physical objects and that kind of thing. And that I found really helpful, honestly. Yeah, so I think that that probably did play into it, and I thought was it's very helpful. And it's also good because it's like um, your ability to learn other things isn't based off of your ability to read
Yeah,
worksheets, right? So I didn't end up falling behind in all my other subjects because I was struggling to read.
Right,
yeah,
right. That
that's
makes a
really
lot of
important.
sense. Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, so how you said that you read really well now. How did you learn to read then, or how were you taught to read?
Yeah, so I basically, as soon as I was diagnosed, I started receiving a combination of Wilson and Orton Gillingham. And honestly, like, as a child, I couldn't really tell the difference between the 2 of them, right? Um, Both of them are, a lot of learning to decipher different syllables, a lot of, practicing different words, chunking words into syllables, sounding things out, a lot of rote, a lot of repetition. And it's not like fun, really, but it was so worth it, right? Because it's very funny, right? The like dyslexia expert who diagnosed me made a prediction. He was like, she's going to struggle for years, but around like 10 or 11, she's going to have a breakthrough and she's going to start reading above grade level and she's going to be fine. And you know what? He was right. Like that, like to the year, like that is the age at which, it took years and years of hard work to have that breakthrough, right? And there was gradual progress over those years, but I was always struggling. But then it sort of just clicked, right? And I was able to read to myself and I would have to read aloud. Like I would have to do it. And then I just started whispering quieter and quieter and quieter. And I was able to actually just hear it in my head. But I still, when I read, I hear things in my head, right?
Mhm.
Which is funny because I mean, I think it's honestly probably good for reading comprehension, but it also means like there are people out there who can like read something and have like have somebody talking in the background or whatever. I like, unless it's like a lot of people talking and it's like a cafe and you can't pick out any individual conversations, I cannot do that. Like,
Yeah.
Interesting.
um,
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of the compensating was through um, first out loud doing it and then in your mind, in your head. Hmm.
yeah, exactly. Because I always really liked words, right? It was just the written words that were a problem.
Hmm.
Right.
So do you read to yourself at the same speed as if you were reading out loud? Then?
No, no, I read much faster than that.
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I actually, I think I did time myself and I actually read faster than most neurotypical people.
Huh.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Huh. And so it sounds like you haven't um, had to explore audiobooks and stuff. Do you use audiobooks at all, or do you
Yeah, so
actually?
I mean, I like audiobooks. Like
Uh-huh.
when I was a kid, I would always like listen to audiobooks and stuff in the car.
Mhm.
And I think that that was good, right? Because it like, and that and my parents reading to me, because, it kept up my love of books and my love of reading, even though like they were a struggle for me to read myself. Um, I'm more a podcast listener now than an audiobook listener, but I still listen to audiobooks sometimes. My husband and I are very, very slowly working our way through the first volume of The Years of Lyndon Johnson on audiobook right now, because that one's like 30 hours long as an audiobook. It is so long. And that's like one of what, like 3 or 4 volumes. It's a lot. And yeah, so I never really used audiobooks like for school um because that felt like giving up. And I don't want to actually treat it that way. Like I don't want people to interpret it that way, but that's what it felt like for me. Um because I pushed myself really really hard and my parents also pushed me very hard. But like they were good about it, but and I don't want to like I think they honestly handled it as well as they could have, but there was very much an idea of expectations will never be lowered. Um you will always perform as well or better than neurotypical people. And that was good in that it pushed me and it didn't like lower expectations, and it means I read very well now. I've been very educationally successful, reasonably professionally successful. um but it does also leave me with like a lot of baggage emotionally, right? Because like I read well now, but like I can't take dictation for the life of me. Like that's just not going to happen. And I'm not a great note taker, and like I've worked through it, but like I've definitely had a professional situation where like they needed me to write a transcript, and I was like just like trying, and they didn't know I was dyslexic, right? Because like it didn't really like I don't normally need accommodations in the workplace. And this was like an internship. I don't even think they were paying me. It was like years ago. Um and I was like shaking and crying trying to figure out like I just can't do this. Like I can't write a transcript, right? No, basically no matter how slow I do it, because the way I write is I hear the word in my head, but I can't hear the word and write it and like do word for word transcripts. And it was something that it was important that it was word for word. Like they needed exact quotes. Um and so I was like just like breaking down in the hallway like what the heck do I do? Like what am I going to do about this? What am I going to do? And eventually I was just like, and I think I was like texting with my boyfriend at the time or whatever, and he was like, "Oh, just, like, tell your supervisor. They're not gonna be mad, like, it'll be fine." Um, and you know what? It was completely fine because, like, it was an internship and they had, like, 10 other interns, so they just reassigned us and, like, had a different intern do that, and it was easy for them, and they had me do something else. Um, but I do think that, like, idea of never lowering expectations can be kind of like a double-edged sword there, right? Because, like, it means that I really don't cut myself a lot of slack. And that's still true to this day. And to some extent it's good, right? Because like there are I think that there are a lot of, educational institutions and stuff who will give up on dyslexic students being able to read well, right? But because I never had the lowered expectations and because my parents put a lot of time and energy and even resources into my education and it matters that they were able to do that, right? Unfortunately, not all parents are like able to do that for their kids. Um it meant that I was able to achieve to my full potential, right? Because I I despise, really lowered expectations most of the time, but never really being willing to lower them for yourself can still be difficult, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, one thing we just released an episode today actually about accommodations, and one point that we emphasized there is that um, accommodations do not equal lowered expectations.
Exactly, that's
And
so
so,
important.
yeah, and so I'm wondering, when you were in like high school and is when it really starts to even middle school, kids start dyslexic kids start to more really need those accommodations. Did you have accommodations then in school?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, the primary, like, help I needed was when I was younger, right, before I learned how to read.
Yeah.
So it was more like tapering off rather than, like,
Okay.
increasing.
Okay.
Um, but so I had an IEP, like, as soon as I entered public school,
Mhm.
because I was coming from Montessori school, which is a private school, and I don't know if, like, it was done officially or if it was just like, "Yeah, your kid needs this tutoring, we're gonna get them this tutoring." I don't know the administrative, like, end of that. Um, so I had an IEP like immediately. Because I entered public school just before I learned how to read fully, right? And one thing I really hated was the like so there was like for spelling tests, right? What they did instead of giving me more help or even like more time to do the tests or really anything that would have helped my learning is that they just made the list of words I had to learn shorter, right? And that's like a lowered expectations thing, and that's kind of frustrating. And I mean, spelling learning how to spell well is actually kind of remarkably low stakes in our world today, right? Because we have spell check. But doing that with other things can be really like educationally problematic, right? Um so when I first started I had like a full on IEP, so there were in classroom aides. They weren't like just there for me. They were there for me and, other students who had various needs. And then I would be pulled out for more reading tutoring. But I was also keeping going with reading tutoring outside of school with some of the teachers I had had at the private school. But the reading tutoring I got in public school was pretty similar. There was just less of it, if that makes sense. Um, and also it was usually with a small group. I don't really think that the group thing was a problem because there were usually like 3 of us who were at a pretty similar place, so that was fine.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't know if it would have been enough on its own, which is a problem. And then the in-classroom aides were really a mixed bag because like some of them were just really nice, really supportive, like understood your needs well. Um, and then some of them are just were just like incredibly annoying, condescending people with a savior complex. Um, and who really like wouldn't let me, struggle through things on my own, or thought that I was much more disabled than I was. Or, just were really, really unhelpful, didn't mesh well, that kind of thing. Um, and that was like really difficult. And I honestly probably still have like some baggage from that. Um, and then, so I kept going with the IEP into middle school, but by then I knew how to read well. So the like special classes really felt like a waste of time, honestly, because like I had accommodations for dyslexia. I was supposed to be getting special tutoring for dyslexia, but that they could do once I knew how to read. But the thing is that the documentation, takes a year or two to catch up, right? So the documentation didn't say I could read. And so they would just keep giving me activities that were geared at people who could not read at the level at which I could read, right? Because I had the experience of once I did learn how to read, I was reading like above grade level, right? So they were giving me things for like basically you're in third grade and can't really read when I was in sixth grade and probably reading at an eighth grade level. And they would just give me more of it rather than scaling up the level. And so eventually I just started they would let me do it in like a sort of hallway place like near the like tutoring classroom, and eventually I would just take out the eighth grade American history textbook and read that and like do one worksheet and then hope they didn't spot me not doing the other worksheets. um and that worked out fine, and I was then very well prepared for eighth grade American history. um and then about sixth grade, I got to get retested and I went off my IEP and just to a 504. Um, and my 504 was basically just for two things. Oh, I forgot to mention earlier. So, um, they, had to so one thing that my parents thought would be really helpful was for me to be able to type my assignments and exams, because it's just easier to organize thoughts that way, right? And I do have lousy handwriting, but I don't necessarily have like clinically significant levels of lousy handwriting, if you know what I mean, right? um so but the thing is, and I'm not sure if this is still a thing, um, but at the time I was in like elementary and middle school, you couldn't get an accommodation to type things just for having dyslexia, um, which seems insane. Um, but it was the case. Um, and so I had to be officially like diagnosed for an educational setting with dysgraphia. Um, I think there's honestly a chance I don't really have dysgraphia. Um, because I'm pretty solid at like drawing and I'm very good at like arts and crafts and little fiddly bits of mechanical things. Like I'm actually pretty good with my hands. Um so but that did mean that I had to be in like occupational therapy for a couple of years, but it meant also, and the occupational therapists were in on this, that like they were like, "Oh no, okay, you're going to be in occupational therapy, but we're not really going to do anything. You just have to be in occupational therapy for 2 years before we can let you use a computer in class." Um so like the only thing I learned in occupational therapy was how to use chopsticks, which is still a useful skill. Um
Right.
yeah, so I eventually
It is.
got, as part of my 504, the ability to use a laptop in class, which was tremendously helpful. I was never like a text to speech person or a having the computer read to me person, but just being able to type things is like so helpful, and makes it much easier. Honestly, not just because of the speed, but also because like I tend to delete and rewrite bits of sentences a lot, or I put a word in the wrong order, honestly, or also just like spelling errors that I can see, but I can only really see if I've typed it out, right? Um, so that was my primary accommodation. And then in middle school, I also had like there was a special class I was in that was like an extra study hall where they help you organize your binder, because I was like bad at organizing my paper. Um, I'm still lousy at organizing paper, and so my thing now has become I have I have a compartment in my apartment that's only for very important documents like my passport, and everything else I only keep digitally. Um, and that's worked out fine. I mean, I prefer to read on paper, but like in terms of like forms and everything, I'll do everything digitally if I can. And typing my essays and everything, obviously. But what was I going to say? So those were really my only accommodations for like the second half of middle school and high school. I didn't even have the like binder organization thing in high school. I just had the typing, and I didn't get extra time. Like that's something a lot of dyslexics get, but it is not how my dyslexia works. No shame on anyone who does get extra time, but like that wasn't my thing. Um, but the thing is that a lot of teachers were surprisingly unwilling to accommodate such a small accommodation as typing assignments. Um, like, um, I had a science teacher who would take way longer to hand back my assignments because I typed them. um, and wouldn't give me feedback like she gave to the other students because I typed them. And I offered to print them. I offered to do everything. And it was in lieu of like lab notebooks. And I'm like, I will cut it out and paste it into a notebook if that's what you want. But that wasn't enough. Um, she was just, yeah, she was just a
Mm,
bad teacher,
really
quite
frustrating.
frankly. And then what was also really frustrating is so I took American Sign Language in lieu of a foreign language in high school. Unfortunately, that was my high school's plan for like if you have a disability, because there wasn't really any disability support for foreign language learning. Which is really frustrating. Honestly, there should be. Like I really feel like I was deprived of the chance to properly learn a foreign language. And I'm not saying like this that American Sign Language isn't like an amazing language and that it's not something that should be taught in high schools, because like it absolutely should be, and it's so cool and it's awesome and I'm glad I had a chance to learn it. But just funneling everyone with a disability into ASL, which is a 2-year program rather than the other languages which are a 4-year program, because they have a disability, is like not the right approach, right? Um and what was really frustrating is that the teacher of that class wouldn't let me type exams. And I'm like, you taught us about the ADA in this class. And it's also like, okay, if I've
Yeah.
invented something that from my computer allows me to capture the motions of ASL signs and translate them to English in the time constraints you set for this test, I don't deserve an A in this class. I deserve like a Nobel Prize, right? Like can't even cheat on that test by typing. Like that's not how that works. But a lot of teachers are like, honestly, I think there's a problem with teachers being more afraid of cheating than they are of students who need accommodations not learning. Um and that's really
Yeah.
frustrating. Most of my teachers were great about it and it was tremendously helpful, but like obviously the things that stick with you are the exceptions.
Well, it's so interesting to hear your unique journey just because it really is so,
Yeah.
everyone's is really so different, which I think points to, all the individualization
Yeah.
that is probably
Yeah.
necessary. Of course,
Mhm.
difficult to get at times, simply because of overcrowding and all kinds of other issues too. But yeah, it's really like, even as we try to talk about specific things and like,
Yeah.
this is very common or that kind of thing. I think it's always good. I think that's
Yeah.
part of what's so helpful in this Dyslexic Voices series, that it really can come through
Yeah.
how everyone is so different in terms of what they need and what helps them. And even just in terms of how the journey progresses, that can
Mm.
change things, right? Like for you, I think in terms of how the reading happened and how, you had the Montessori to
Yeah.
begin, like it set you up so differently than a lot of other people. So it's really interesting
Yeah.
and I think helpful for people to hear.
Thank you.
Yeah. So maybe we should you talked a little bit about some compensation mechanisms you use now as an adult with dyslexia. Um but I think it, it's sort of interesting, like what's it like now as an adult with a in the workplace and so on. Do you have accommodations in the workplace? Do you have sort of other compensation mechanisms
So,
that you use?
I don't have accommodations in the workplace. I mean, I could probably get them if I needed them, but there aren't really like clear ones that would make sense in my current position. I work as like an instructional assistant, which is like a professional TA. Like I'm not in grad school, but like I assist with the teaching of college classes. Um and so the only thing that my dyslexia really negatively affects is honestly the same things that affected me as a student, which are I'm not a great note taker. Um and I'm not great at remembering or memorizing information, right? Um so there aren't really like accommodations that can be set up around that because it's not like the professor isn't going to share their notes with me because they're worried I'm going to cheat, right? Because I'm the TA. So if they're not sharing their notes with me, it just means that like
Right.
they're basically a bad boss or like a bad professor and they don't have notes. Um and that does happen. I can't give you more details because that would be unprofessional, even though like I am, of course, keeping this completely separate from my professional life, which is why I'm not on camera. Um, but um, what was I gonna say? So like I don't really have accommodations for that. Um, like my job does require a fair amount of reading. It's actually slightly less than would probably be required of an average college student though. So like it's not an insane amount of reading. I read at a pretty similar speed to other people, so like it's not an issue for me to have to read that much. One thing that's frustrating is like textbook publishers as an anti plagiarism tool make it really hard to cut and paste text from their textbooks as like a note-taking thing. Which can be really frustrating because like obviously if I'm going to be using this stuff for teaching, I want to have really in-depth notes and copying things down is very hard for me. Um, so that can be very frustrating, but that's really more on like textbook publishers than my employer. And we all know textbook publishers are a mess. Um, especially from an accessibility standpoint. Oh my god, I had this textbook in college that like I normally get my textbooks on paper, but I got this one online because it was like half the price. And um when you zoomed in, because like my eyes are fine, but tiny fonts are really hard to read. Um, when you zoomed in to the point where it was like comfortable for me to read, you could see the pixels on the letters, which is really distracting and makes it really hard to
Yeah.
read. And I was just like, how do you make a textbook this badly? Like, oh my god, did you just encode all the pages as images rather than text? Like, what happened? And I want to clarify, like, I wasn't making the font huge. I was making it like at most like 14 point. Like but right, like so I don't have official accommodations really at work. Um Occasionally if there's like a class with multiple TAs, I'll be like to one of the other TAs, will be like, "Hey, like I'm not an awesome note taker, partially for dyslexia reasons. Like I will take on this other part of the class. I will do this extra thing for you. Can I use your notes for this thing?" Um and that sort of thing is usually fine. Because I'm a generally pretty hard worker and a pretty generous employee. So most of the people who are like my direct, the people who are at my level rather than the professors, like the other TAs, they're mostly okay to take a thing off my plate because I take a lot of things off their plate, right? Um, but it's more like that sort of thing than it is like direct accommodations. Like I legitimately can't even remember if my boss knows I'm dyslexic. Um,
Mhm.
like I've mentioned it in the past
I'm
to other
curious about
bosses, but I can't remember if it's come up in
right.
conversation with this one.
I was just gonna say I'm
Yeah.
curious about sort of the positives too, because
Yeah.
of course we're talking about challenges here, but it's is a neurodiversity thing, and
Yeah.
you already mentioned design and these different pieces that can be considered strengths instead. How do you notice that? As you as you've gone through
Yeah.
schooling and into your career.
So I do think the design sensibility thing is like a thing I have. I'm quite good at like making little geometric designs or remembering patterns, like geometric patterns specifically and that kind of thing. And I'm good at graphics. I I do that for my YouTube channel, and I also do social media for like a local environmental organization. So I'm good at that sort of thing, but it can be frustrating because like, and this isn't just people with dyslexics, but like people with dyslexia, but like anyone with a design sensibility. Um, will notice things that some people just don't notice. And so it is like I'm driven crazy by ugly graphics. Um, but then you have to explain to
Mhm.
people like, hey, this isn't good, and it's like, just let me remake it. But yeah, so I would say that the design sensibility thing is a big one. I would also say that like conversational communication is a strength. For whatever reason, I keep stumbling over my words today, but that doesn't normally happen to me. I have like no fear of public speaking. And I'm pretty good at sort of just saying what I think and communicating information verbally. And I also think that it's given my writing a more conversational tone, which is sometimes a strength and sometimes a weakness. Because I hear things when I write, right? So, like, it's not that different for me writing versus talking, if that makes sense. Writing's just slower because I don't know if I can type as fast as I talk. Um, or maybe it's faster, but I think it's faster than I talk, but slower than I think. Does that make sense? Um, yeah. Um,
Mhm.
Yeah.
yeah, so I would say that and just
Yeah, I
sort of
get.
like creativity. Like I think I come to different conclusions about how to solve problems and stuff than other people do. And usually that's a good thing. Usually that's like a creative thing. Occasionally it does mean that I miss something that they consider to be obvious to them, right? Because I just jump to different assumptions. Um, but I would say those are sort of the main ones.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, again, it's sort of unique, like with
Yeah.
each person and what
Yeah.
sort of comes up for the strengths as well. Some people have sort of the like, um, liking to build
Yeah.
things or something like that. It can come out like in all kinds of different ways. Yeah, so it's good to always
Yeah.
include that. Sometimes we
Yeah.
forget because we want to, of
Yeah.
course, always hear about the
And
overcoming
then of course,
challenges part
but it's
too.
also
But
difficult, right? Because I've never not been dyslexic. So I just have to go with like what are the things that are
Right.
identified to associate with dyslexia that are true about me that are good, rather than just everything I'm good at in life, right?
right,
Um yeah.
yeah. If you could tell your younger self something, and this may be, I don't know if this what age you'd want to pick for this, because it sounds like overall the reading came pretty with a lot of hard work, but pretty well for you. And then, but then there were some frustrating experiences, with aides and various people, sometimes teachers. What would you tell yourself at some given age
I
in the
mean,
past, do you think?
I did learn how to read pretty young, but there were, like 4 years of very intense struggle, right? And I definitely have a lot of memories of like I'm, 7. I don't want to do 2 hours a week of extra homework so I can learn how to read, right? It feels like nothing. It feels like I'm not getting there. So I guess I'd like to go back to like my, 8-year-old self and just like read her a book. Um, be like,
Mm.
hey, everything you're doing
Oh,
now
that'd be
is
cool.
worth it. You just need to keep doing it. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that calls out the importance of something we've mentioned in other episodes too, of like, can even while your dyslexic kid is working on the remediation stuff, like you can continue reading them high level stuff because they can generally handle it. Just to
Yeah. Although
keep that
I have the funniest
interest
story
going.
of how I sort of
Hmm.
realized my reading breakthrough, which is that all my friends were really into the like Warrior Cats books, you know? Um, and my mom starts reading me the first one and she hates it. She just thinks it's a terrible book. And she is like, I won't keep reading you this. I think you can read it on your own. And I had been starting to have breakthroughs, like the easier books I had been reading, the non-chapter books, like they had started getting easier. So I think she was recognizing something. It wasn't just like an artificial time she was deciding on that. And so I just struggled my way through that book, right? And by the time I finished it, I could basically read. Um, but no, I mean, obviously keep reading your kids' books, but it is funny that my mom's refusal to read me that specific
Yeah.
book was like an impetus for my breakthrough. Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you want to say to anyone else? I guess there's sort of three different categories I'm thinking of. One is dyslexic kids themselves, one is maybe their parents and supporting them or other caregivers, and the other maybe just the general public. I'm just curious, maybe it's the same thing you'd want to say to all of them, or different. What like advice or tip or insight or
Huh.
anything you want to share?
Um, so I guess for kids, it's like you you can be very successful. Um, but unfortunately, like a lot of the work has to come from you and at a really young age, which is unfortunate. But like um your parents aren't there every day. Your teachers aren't there when you're doing your homework. Like you just have to do everything and you have to advocate for yourself and you have to learn that really, really young. And that can be really tough, um, but I mean, it's useful later in life, right? Getting those self advocacy skills really young, but you do have to develop them really young, and there's sort of no substitute for that, even from parents, right? Which is unfortunate, right? Because you don't want to think that a 8-year old has to advocate for their own accommodations, has to make sure they're not being ignored in an educational setting, has to make sure they're receiving the help they're supposed to get. Um, but unfortunately, a parent just can't do all of it. Um, and I wish teachers could be relied upon to do every bit of it, but they're not. I mean, even if they are perfect, they're not inside the kid's head. Um, so I guess part of it is also then like with parents of dyslexic kids is like you can do a lot for your kid, and you can provide a lot of support to them, and you absolutely should, but you also need to provide them with the tools to advocate for themselves and to work through things for themselves. Um, so it's not about, providing workarounds and everything. It's definitely not about lowering expectations. I mean, I guess it is about workarounds a little bit, but what I mean more is that dyslexics, in my view, have the same potential to learn and the same potential to learn most skills, but that they'll need to learn differently, right? And that finding those different methods of learning is what's important. Um, and that like dyslexic kids need to know that they're dyslexic, and they need to know that things will be hard, but they need to know that they are not limited in what they can achieve, really. um but that they need to push, and sometimes they even need to be pushy to grown-ups. um and that's tricky, but it's
Mhm.
true. um and then I think with the general public, the main thing is illiteracy and dyslexia aren't the same thing. um because that
Mm.
is something that I hear
Yeah.
a lot from the general public and from people who should definitely know better. um and also that dyslexia can't be cured, and that arguably it shouldn't be. Right? um
Mhm.
because there are a lot of people, and the reason I'm connecting it to the people who think dyslexia and illiteracy are the same thing is that people think once you've learned how to read, you are no longer dyslexic, or that if you're dyslexic, you can't learn how to read. And both of those assumptions are really devastating, like really, really bad. Because dyslexics can learn how to read. Um, and if they struggle with reading their whole lives, which is a possibility, there are, ways of working around that. Um, but it's not good of systems to lower expectations, right? Like I'm a I'm a huge believer in people using whatever they need to be able to do what they want to do in their lives, right? Like if you can't read well because of dyslexia and text to speech or whatever is helpful for you, that's awesome. But I do think that there still needs to be an impetus on schools that your student has dyslexia is not an excuse to not teach them how to read and write. You should still be you're still responsible for teaching them how to learn how to read and write, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really well said. It's a
Yeah.
subtle but really important point there.
Yeah, and unfortunately,
Oh
those
my god,
assumptions are
yes.
still so widespread.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, all right. Well, I want to give you a chance to tell people where they
Yes.
can find you
Yeah,
online,
so
your
I
YouTube
have
channel.
a YouTube channel about political psychology, which is the psychology of politics, and it's what my master's is in. I should clarify, my master's is in political psychology. I am not a clinical psychologist or any kind of like educational psychologist. Uh, do not assume that I, like, from a professional standpoint, know anything special about dyslexia, or any like other things like that. Um, Sorry, I just always feel the need to put that disclaimer on there because there are so many people making just wild psychology content on the internet. Um, yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, my channel is about political psychology. It's aimed at the general public and at activists. I try and be funny and have it be entertaining and not terribly, terribly grim. Um, and there's usually pictures of cats in my video as well. Thanks.
Great. And we will link to that, of course. You can put the link in the notes.
Thanks for
Um,
having me.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for sharing your story.
Thanks.
yeah, we appreciate it a lot. Thank you.